Now, I caught up with Peter Collignon, an infectious disease physician at ANU Medical School earlier, where I asked what Australia can learn from the countries such as America and West Europe that have already begun rolling out their preferred COVID vaccines.
So they've got emergency registration of mainly the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, which are quite new technology, messenger RNA. And so far, on the data available, appear to be quite successful. So the vaccines we're going to have here is, again, the Pfizer vaccine, but we probably won't get that till another couple of months. And then we've got the AstraZeneca one, which looks like it's promising as well, although the data isn't available as much for them. But we've got to remember, we don't have uncontrolled transmission here. So we have time up our sleeve to actually get the regulatory process to look at the data that's available. And more importantly, we've got the ability to see what has happened in the US and in Europe when they roll out these vaccines, to make sure when they roll it out to millions of people, there's not unexpected side effects, and that we get the efficacy that is expected, particularly in the most at-risk group, which is the 70, 80 and 90-year-old. So we've got time up our sleeve, and that's a big advantage to us to make sure when we do roll out vaccines, and there'll be more than one, that they're both safe, they're effective, and they work in the real world, because you've got to remember the Pfizer vaccine's got to be kept at -70, and that's some practical problems compared to vaccines you can just keep in the fridge and how you roll them out.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that -70, Peter, if I could, because, I mean, this is going to be one of those aspects of the rollout in Australia which may well slow the rollout. I mean, not every GP clinic, for example, has a facility, do they, to be able to store a Pfizer vaccine at -70?
Well, most of them will not have that ability. I mean, the ordinary freezers we have in our fridge are -20.
Yep.
So -70 is mainly what's in research laboratories or pathology laboratories. So the way that Pfizer's got over that is to make special suitcases with dry ice that keep it at that really low temperature. But that's not practical for everywhere. And probably what it means is for that particular vaccine, it won't be available at every GP. It'll be available in selected centres where people will go to and be vaccinated in, basically bigger groups because of the practical logistics of rolling out that vaccine. And the AstraZeneca, if it comes out to be as good as the other vaccines, and I guess the press release or the information from the company today suggests that, although we need to see the data, that's actually much better because it's available to be rolled out at refrigeration temperature, 4 degrees. So that makes it much more practical to be rolled out much further with a lot more locations that are able to then give the vaccine.
I mentioned that date of March. Now, a lot of people, I think, have in mind, Peter, this false sense of reality that come March, every second Australian will have had the jab, and probably by April or May, everyone will be vaccinated and back to the footy we go, big crowds and the rest of it. The fact is, though, isn't it, that it'll take probably to the end of 2021 or nearabouts before we have a significant or sizable percentage of the population vaccinated.
Yeah, I think that's very likely. I mean, who we hopefully will get vaccinated before winter, which is our next biggest risk period, is those who are older and most at risk, and maybe our healthcare workers who are on the front line. But for most adults in Australia, probably most won't be able to be vaccinated till September or October, and maybe even later. And you've got to remember, there's actually no vaccine currently for children that looks like it's going to be available soon. So that's probably a quarter of the Australian population. So to really get good immunity and stop transmission of a virus, you need a vaccine that's 90% effective, that 90% of the population receives, such as measles, German measles. So that'll be a while. And for travel and things, we've got to have most of the world vaccinated. So that'll be another year or two. So
I was going to say about March, though. We keep talking about March, don't we? I mean, this is what the government's saying. It may even be February, from what I hear, late February when they start. I mean, all these things are a moving feast. But I suppose by waiting until March, as we said, America, much of Western Europe have already started the jabs for the over 90s and certain groups. This will, or potentially at least, give some confidence to those who are reluctant to get the jab in Australia. There is a broad reticence among a very sizable percentage of the population, I think, Peter, to go and have a COVID vaccine, considering the very short time frame, an emergency time frame really, that has gone from the beginning of research to now implementation in the Northern Hemisphere.
Well, I don't think it's unreasonable for people to have, want to be able to be sure that this is both safe and effective.
Yes.
And the preliminary data suggests that, but we need a lot more data. Remember, this is really rushed and it's different vaccines. So I think Australia is in a very fortunate position that we've got another few months up our sleeve to be able to really look at the data when it's rolled out in other populations to make sure it is everything as promised. So, yes, we're in a fortunate position. The reality is the only vaccine that's approved so far is the Pfizer one and the Moderna one. Australia is going to get 10 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine. But you've got to remember, we're not on the top of the list of the world for priority for this vaccine because there's a lot of places with a lot more transmission than Australia that you think from an ethical point of view have a higher priority for risk group. But we will get them, so we will have our risk groups I think, vaccinated to a large proportion before winter, which is the critical thing. But we've got 2 or 3 months up our sleeve to really ensure the data is there to make sure it's safe, but also that we roll out this vaccine in such a way that it actually works when it's given. This -70 is a technical issue. Already in Germany, I've seen reports to say they may have to throw away 10% of the vaccine because the cold chain or that ultra cold chain wasn't kept. So we've got a bit of time up our sleeve, not only to make sure the data is there to check it works in study conditions, but in real life when it's rolled out in America and Britain, learn from whatever goes wrong to make sure that we have it done optimally, not only with the best vaccines that are available, but deliver it in such a way that minimises any chance of problems to people, and follow up as many people as we can to make sure that what happens in real life is what the brochure, if you like, or the original data suggests. We've got to keep a close eye on this.
That's a very good point. Very good point. I mean, there are a bunch of vaccines around the world, though. We keep talking about Pfizer, Moderna, and obviously AstraZeneca through Oxford University. But the Russians have Sputnik 5. Others are working on things as well. I think the Russian vaccine's been sent to Argentina in the last 5 or so days, and they're rolling it out there. What's the gold standard from your point of view with all of these vaccines on the table? Is it the Pfizer vaccine?
Well, I don't think we have the answer to that because it's all preliminary data. I mean, the Sputnik vaccine is really very similar to the AstraZeneca from what I can see. The one that is a bit different, there's a Chinese one that is actually a more traditional vaccine because it's made from, if you like, inactive components of the virus that at least in Turkey, the data I've seen from there looks like it's pretty good. The good news is that there's lots of different vaccines all being used and manufactured in different ways. But what they have in common is they make antibodies or present what they call the spike protein to our bodies, and we make antibodies and white cells to that. And even though it's been made in 4 or 5 different ways, it all appears so far to be having the same effect, with vaccines that are at least 70% effective and up to 90% or more. So that's good news. We still need more data, in my view, but all the news is looking promising.
Well, again, that extra time up until March helps Australia in all of that respect. Look, Peter, just quickly before you go, and you've been generous with your time, obviously Sydney in particular, with New Year's Eve on the horizon, there will be restrictions in place. I know you're one of the more sober minds in the whole COVID debate. There are some panic merchants out there. You're not one of them. But obviously the Premier of New South Wales is saying to people in Sydney, look, don't go to the CBD, stay at home. In the past, we've heard that at least being outside is better than being indoors when we're talking about COVID-19. I mean, there's very little restriction for hundreds of people to go to a shopping centre. We've seen all sorts of images lately of thousands of people at bargain outlets for Boxing Day sales, and yet people are being told, well, look, don't go really outside, certainly in the city on New Year's Eve. What's your understanding of the handling of an event like New Year's Eve? Is it the best advice to say to people, look, just stay at home?
Well, I think what the New South Wales Health and the Premier has given out, I think, is sensible advice. They've controlled this by restricting the northern beaches and quite reasonable restrictions on the movement of those people. There hasn't been uncontrolled spread to the rest of Sydney, which is really good news, although we can't be absolutely sure of that. But what we do know is if you want to spread this virus, go to an indoor venue with alcohol, with great crowds together. Well, that sounds like a New Year's Eve party to me, and I think that's what we should avoid. Outside is safer than inside, but nighttime is not as safe as outside. You know, ultraviolet light, sunlight seems to be much safer. So I think because we don't know what's going on, well, we can't be 100% sure, that taking extra precautions like only having 10 people to a New Year's Eve party and avoiding hundreds of thousands of people going by public transport and all congregating together at Sydney Harbour is probably a good idea until we see the cases are going down to, 0 cases or only one every day or so, because while it looks like it's all under control in Sydney, we can't be 100% sure, and giving up a little bit, like going to a boozy New Year's Eve party with large numbers of people, is probably not a big sacrifice compared to having be shut down in your home and not being able to work and really having uncontrolled spread.